two countries, but the actual final product was completely different.
Was it always your mother that cooked?
No, my father cooked as well, predominantly my mother, but if my mother wasn't available, my father would cook. I was very fortunate that both could cook, and they both could cook well. In fact, even in my own home, I cook a bit. I'm capable of looking after myself. I can cook Italian food. I can cook non-Italian food. But Anne, my partner, she cooks both, and she does them both very well. So I have no problems there. My children have been educated to appreciate both types of food, and they've all had the ability to eat both.
At secondary school, who was your biggest influence among the teachers there?
That's a difficult one. I don't think there was any one, because at the end of the day, I always feel my father was my best influence. Albeit the teachers had an influence in talking to you, and you saw them on a day-to-day basis. Every year you had a form teacher. That form teacher was the one that was the most influential to you during that period. But then when you go to the next year, in the next form, it would be another teacher, and that one would be responsible for you for the whole year. So to say there was one predominant one, I would say no. I tell you what they did become. They became psychologists. They knew how to juggle you. To use it in simplistic terms, if you had a subject you were bad at, or you were struggling with, and they wanted you to work harder, in one of my particular subjects, which was English, they basically told me I was wasting my time, because we did GCEs. So, of course, having failed miserably in my first exam and got the second lowest grade you could get, it came to the resit, which in GCEs you could do in the winter term. The English teacher basically said to me I was wasting my time, not to bother. Of course, the more he said not to bother, the more it made me determined to sit it. And of course, the next time in the resit, I passed it with second highest grade you could get. And I turned around to him and he said, "Well, I told you could do it if you really wanted to." I said, "But you told me I was wasting my time." And he looked at me and smiled. And so there was that, but my father overall, I could clash with my mother constantly, because my mother always had, I loved her to bits, but she always had a philosophy, I'm your mother, you know. My father never ever came out with statements, but he did have the art and the ability to tell me something without actually telling me, and giving me the feeling that I'd actually thought of a solution. So in many ways he's possibly a psychiatrist, a psychologist in his own right as well. So possibly, as I say, my father and my mother were both very influential, more so probably than any of the teachers.
Did you come home at weekends?
No. Came home for I went to my grandmother's in Musselburgh for the odd day out, which was one Sunday in every 3 months, and each term had a half term when I came home, but I was only home for holidays. No weekends were spent, it was 24/7.
Did that feel lonely?
For the first month or so. Then you make friendships, you start building bonds, you start understanding that you've got to stand on your own. Now at 11 you think that's a bit dramatic, but you actually learn quite quickly how to defend yourself and how to look after yourself. So I was very fortunate in that way, and it didn't cause me any problems.
Was there corporal punishment in the school?
There was in those days. There was the cane, strap, detention, PE, jankers as they called it, where the prefects would take you at 5 o'clock in the morning and give you an hour's PE outside. You know, it was very, very strict in that way.
So was it quite hierarchical in terms of the boys?
Oh yes, absolutely. If you were in the first year, you were classified the scruff of the school, and obviously all the way up. It wasn't as bad as Tom Brown's school days, but there was this kind of us and them. By the time it got to about third or fourth year, all that had kind of died a death, because I went to school in the early 60s, so we still had a bit of the post-war attitude and pre-war attitude at boarding schools. By the time I got to the mid-60s, it started to die a death. All that started to slowly die and disappear.
Great social change in the early mid-60s.
Oh, very much.
How much did that have an impact in your kind of thinking or philosophy or music tastes even?
Well, my music tastes were actually very simple, and it really is terrible. Obviously I knew the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, everything, but I either liked something or I disliked it. But not even myself, I could never tell you what kind of music I was going to like or dislike. I just listened to it, and if I liked it, I liked it. If I didn't like it, I just walked away from it. Music was never a very important part of my life. It was necessary because we all wanted to watch Top of the Pops with bands, people and everything else, as it was in those days, and it was great and it was fantastic, but no, I could take and leave music. I was never that addicted to it. I knew what I liked, but that was it. Strange enough, I had some classical music I liked, and I couldn't understand why, but I just did. I didn't try and analyse it too much.
Was there any Italian music influence or interest?
No, none at all. I knew an awful lot of Italian musicians. I had things like the traditional country Italian songs. Strange enough, I think probably more so now, I've found a liking to some of them, much to the dismay of Anne, because I put these CDs on that I pick up in Italy sometimes, and it's got very old Italian music on it, going back to the 40s, 50s and 60s. She looks at me with, what's this? But it's only because to me it's a little bit of nostalgia. Maybe thinks it makes me think of my parents and their approach to life. I mean, they obviously in their time had it a lot harder than I did, because this, as you quite rightly said, the 50s and 60s was a massive, particularly the 60s, a massive change in culture and attitude in Europe, and I was caught in that cusp. Whereas my parents went through the harder period. My mother and father both were born during one war and lived through the second war. We never had anything like that. In fact, I think I was the second generation, the second year the conscription was banned. I was the second one to actually miss it. The year before me missed it as well. And conscription, I think, in this country educated a lot of people. I felt that what I gained in boarding school, a lot of kids would have got through conscription. And that's a degree of self-discipline and regimentation. All that's gone now. There's no self-discipline now. The kids run around with a completely different attitude. They also know the law a lot better than you do as well. And you always have to watch what you say, what you do. We've become overly PC. That change started in the 60s, and we've reached the stage we are now, and we're a million miles apart. And as much as it's good to be PC, we have become overly PC. Like I said to you in the last part, albeit internment was very hard for a lot of the Italians during the war, it was understood by people like my father that it was necessary. Now, some of the ones who hadn't had military service abroad or had not had an influence felt they were getting hard done by because they felt British or Scottish or whatever. But it was the best way of dealing with it, and say, don't start there trying to analyse and separate who's good and who's bad, all the way. Unfortunately, now we've become over the top PC, and we have people who threaten to blow our soldiers up, our country up. They get tried, we're paying them social security, we're looking after their families, but they still want to blow us up. And you ask yourself, hold on, is this correct? Is this right? I mean, and why don't we send these people back to their own country? because they're terrorists here, and if they go back they might get killed. Hang on a minute, they want to blow us up. They've admitted to it, and yet we keep them here. We don't even intern them until they get caught doing something, and then when we do, they get the best treatment because we're civilized. Define it and understand it. There's a very thin line between common sense and exaggeration, and I think we've gone over the top to exaggeration level now.
In this period of mid-late 60s, when you were a teenager, what influenced the invention of the teenage years, rebelliousness, growing your hair, all that sort of aspect? Did it have an impact on you when you were at boarding school?
Not so much at boarding school, but funnily enough, here in the cafe, I remember vividly in the summer months the mods and the rockers coming to Guruk, and I remember my father used to on many occasions let them both in, and of course you read about the big riots in Brighton and places, Southend and all these places where they went, and it was an education for my father to have two groups in the cafe, one at one side at night and the other one at the other side. And the only difference was one drove a Lambretta and the other one drove a motorbike. It's actually quite funny because when I first converted the cafe, the steelwork that was done in here was done by a friend of mine who turned out to be actually during that period a rocker, and as he quoted to me, I was thrown out of here on numerous occasions by your father. So he said, but I find it quite funny that I'm now making a piece of steelwork which will probably be here long after I've gone. I said, well, that's quite possible, and that came out on many occasions, not just with the rockers, also the mods. But it's gone through its phases: the punk period, the mods and rockers period, the rock and roll era. We've managed to go through a fair generation.
Did you sort of align yourself with any cultural grouping?
No. I, strangely enough, not being a great one for dancing and music, didn't really have that sort of affinity. I kept my distance from it. I preferred football and rugby. I was more into sports. As I said, music was an interesting hobby, but just in the back burner, not in the front burner. Sport was always in the front burner for me. I played rugby and soccer right up till I was 44, 48. When I realised that knocks and bashes were taking longer to disappear than they used to. Then I realised being self-employed in doing that is not a good combination.
But did they play both football and rugby at your secondary school?
Yes. We had soccer during the week on a Wednesday, and we had, forgetting inter-house games which are played every single day, Monday to Friday, we had inter-school games which were played on a Wednesday for soccer and Saturday for the rugby, which is one thing I feel a lot of the kids are now missing, because they don't have, unless you join a club, you don't have inter-school games like you used to, because teachers are now told, unless they get paid for it, not to do it, which is fine, but I feel the children are losing out. Because my father taught me one thing: healthy in body is healthy in mind. I just love sport. In fact, I loved it more than studying. Every sports team that was going, I was in it. For one thing or another, I just loved it.
Sorry, I don't think I've established what the school was called.
Holt School, Holt. It was the school was actually used to be in Lockerbie in Dumfries, Jarden Hall, and then it moved in 1963, I think it was, to Whittingham House outside Haddington, and that used to be Lord Balfour's old house. And strange enough, our library was Lord Balfour's study, and that's where he signed Palestine over to the Jews in whatever year it is, I can't remember. 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, thereabouts. And I stayed there until I left, which was 1979. And then I was studying in London, and then I went to university in Italy, and I worked and lived in Italy for 10 years after that.
So primary 1 to primary 7 here, and then it was first year through till 6th year?
6th year, yeah, or remove as they called it, in just outside Edinburgh.
Right. And did you have set ambitions when you were at secondary school?
Not really, other than the fact you always want to succeed. One thing I did want to do was travel a bit, which I did achieve, albeit I travelled in Europe. My father, when he was younger, did a lot of travelling. I think that his stories kind of got me going. I felt that was quite important to do as much travelling as I possibly could, just to understand other people.
So was that immediately after you left school?
Virtually, yeah. Because even at school, our school trips were always abroad. We were fortunate enough to be taken these places. But you understand if you stay in an area and don't experience anything else, you can become very narrow-viewed and very narrow-opinioned. I always felt that the more I see, the more I would understand. And I think it has worked in many ways. I've never understood a fanatic in any real way. I can understand a fanatic about soccer as a player or a supporter to a point. I can understand a fanatic about religion to a point, but there's extreme fanaticism which I've never understood, and that's the main area that I've tried to steer well clear of, because it's a no-winning argument. It's a bottomless argument, basically.
So did you apply to university from school?
Yes.
Did you have a choice? Or
No, I had a choice. I could have gone to one up here, but I eventually chose one down in London, purely because it was a very close step between a university and a polytechnic. It was actually a polytechnic. I went to Kingston and Twickenham, and it's now a university, but in those days it was a polytechnic. So it was a close call. But apart from that, I also had one of my classmates who was going down to do the same course as well with me. So there was two of us, so it made life a bit easier.
And what subjects did you take?
Of all things, it was actually Italian, business studies and computers. But in the old days, when I say computers, it makes me laugh, because they were actually, their idea of a small computer was a room, and it was paper tape and cards. So you were churning them out all the time and doing flow charts and everything. So the relationship of computers today and computers then are a million miles apart.
It must have been quite exciting feeling you were in at the beginning.
Oh, absolutely. It was. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed it. In actual fact, it was one of the subjects I got top marks in. And I actually did a few extra exams and certificates in the Royal Society of Arts in computers. But if you try and relate it to then and now, you can't. It's just impossible. The subject, I mean, our computer room was dust free. It was one of the very few universities that did have a computer in those days, and you walked in and you had to go through 2 or 3 different doors before you actually got into the computer room, because you couldn't contaminate the environment. It was very unusual, but it worked. I think we had 2 machines. We had an IBM and we had a company called Burroughs. And I think just as I was leaving, they were putting a Honeywell in one as well. But I'm trying to figure out, in the space of 10 years, computers went from that size to that size. And you think, where's the relationship here? It lost me in transit, because I started doing other things. Computers were not the kind of thing that I had anything to do with. So.
Where did you stay when you you were living in London?
Sorry, I'll just get this stopped. Otherwise it'll keep bleeping. I stayed, well, I had 3 flats in my 5-year period. My first flat was actually digs in a place called Hampton Hill, which was very pleasant. The landlady was bizarre to say the least, and we were as good as kicked out there the first 6 weeks. Then we moved into another set of digs in Kingston upon Thames, and the landlady there was lovely. We stayed there to the end of the year, and then we moved to a flat which was in Broad Lane, and I stayed there for a year or so. And once I finished there, I moved into my last flat, which was in Castleknoll Mansions in Barnes, and it was tremendous. There was 5 of us in it, 4 in one and 5 in the other. And when I think, that having lived at boarding school, having gone into a flat, made you very self-sufficient and self-resilient. You have to do your own washing, you're looking after yourself, pay your own bills, earn your own money to pay your bills. The only thing that we had in those days were grants to help you study. But apart from that, everything else was on your own back.
Did you have a part-time job at all?
I had a few. Nothing that was dramatic, because in those days people didn't like to employ students, but not lots of people. My parents subsidised me to a point. When there was any black holes appeared, but I did everything from moving furniture to washing out swimming pools to delivering boats. You name it, I did it. Worked in the odd bar. I did everything and anything I could. I always tried to find something that was sociable more than antisocial. In other words, working with other people and mixing with people, it was always good.
You said you did 5 years, so did you do postgraduate work as well?
No, the 5th year was, it was the start of the infamous last recession, where it was a petrol crisis, they called it. And I tried desperately to get a job in London. I ended up doing wee jobs here and ever, but the best job I ended up getting, believe it or not, was working with Yellow Pages, which was purely commission, and it was an absolute nightmare. And from there I left, and I got an opportunity to go to Italy, to university there. And at that point there, I took a gamble. It was more a calculated risk than a gamble. I had a chance of a job, and I was going to earn more if I had a grasp of Italian. Albeit I could understand Italian, I couldn't actually speak it particularly well, or read it or write it particularly well. But I certainly understood if somebody spoke to me. So I went over to university over there for a year, and I did technical commercial Italian and Italian art. I crammed. It was a 2 or 3 year course I pushed into a year, and after that I ended up working over there for 10 years. All with the same company. I was a bookie basically. I worked for the Italian equivalent of Ladbrokes.
But while you were in London, how was your relationship with your mother and father, and indeed Guruk itself? How has that maintained?
It's one of those, we always spoke, my parents and I always spoke by phone. And they popped down now and again to see me, and I would pop up. There was a strong continuity. We never actually severed any relationships. We never had any reason to sever. We always had a good relationship between us. So continuity was always quite easy with both my parents. As I said to you earlier on, my mother was always going to be my mother, but my father managed to be able to be him without him telling me all the time he was being me.
So, but 10 years in Italy, how would you describe that part of your life then?
Very, very good. Very good. I saw and worked in virtually every part of Italy, from the very north to Sicily. I met very interesting people. I had a chance of not just learning through education, but also learning through life, different things. And it made me appreciate what I had more than I ever